Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Positive Youth Outcomes Committee is going to present this on behalf of CJCA today, but we'll get started in just a minute. I see a lot of people are still joining today's webinar. We've got over 300 people registered, so thank you for joining us this afternoon. Since everybody is coming in, I do want to make some quick housekeeping notes before we get started. My name is Brendan Donahue. I'm the technology manager here at CJCA, and a couple tips for going through our webinar today. We recommend either, you have two options for listening to your audio today. You can either listen through your computer or you can dial in on the telephone. The big trick here, though, is make sure if you're dialing in on the telephone that you've chosen the telephone option on your control panel. A lot of times when we get people that complain about echo or feedback, it's related to the telephone option being selected with the computer audio at the same time. So make sure you choose the telephone option if that's what you're using. Otherwise, you can listen to us right through your computer speakers. We do have a lot of people. We've already got 150 in the webinar today, so everyone's going to be muted for the duration of the presentation, but that's okay. You can ask us questions anytime throughout the course of the presentation. You can type in your questions right here on this panel. We will leave time for questions at the end of the session, but again, I want to remind you, type them in at any time, and if you want to direct them towards any one of today's panelists, please feel free to do so. We will be doing a video recording, so if you'd like to go back and watch this again, you can do so. We'll also make available copies of the PowerPoint slides, which will be available. We'll send them by email within 48 hours of the end of today's webinar. So if you're looking for a copy of the slides, just keep an eye on your inbox. We usually get them out within the next day or two. So we will be sure to make everything available to you afterwards, and we'll do more on that towards the end here. Well, we've only got an hour to cover today's topic, so I do want to get right into it, and I'll hand it right over to Peter Forbes, Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services and the Chair of our Positive Youth Outcomes Committee. So Peter, tell us how we got here today.
Sure. So Brendan already introduced my title and my role with the Positive Youth Outcome Committee. It's one of 4 committees through CJCA, and we're planning a series of calls regarding education in the juvenile justice context for 2018. The topics range from classroom excellence to emerging challenges and opportunities associated with technology to re-entry and more. The first call, today's call, is focused on national research and the landscape of education for justice-involved youth in America. I want to recognize Mike Dempsey and his team at CJCA for their leadership on this issue and on this series. I want to recognize Michelle Phillips on my team for coordinating a lot of the details. Darlene Conroy at CJCA, who also has been very helpful in getting this call and the series mapped out. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read bios for our presenters. Their information will be available in the materials that are sent out related to this call. We're very fortunate to have Kate Burdick and Nadia Mozaffar from the Children's Law Center. Kate and Nadia are both distinguished staff attorneys at the Children's Law Center in Philadelphia and are focused on educational rights for children in the juvenile justice and child welfare systems. Kate helped draft the blueprint for change that will be a prime focus for today's call. Phil Harris is an emeritus professor of criminal justice at Temple University, where he taught courses on juvenile justice, organizational management, and policy development for over 35 years. Phil is also the person who originally promoted the idea of sponsoring an educational series, so thank you, Phil. Simone Gosselin is a principal researcher for human services and public health programs for the American Institutes for Research, where he serves as the director for the National Evaluation and Technical Assistance Center for the Education of Youth who are neglected, delinquent, or at risk. Simone has also provided an awful lot of energy and intellectual capital in helping us get this series started and mapped out in I think, a real comprehensive way. And I'm going to hand it off to Simone, who is going to get us started.
Thanks so much, Peter. Appreciate that. Good afternoon to all the participants. I think this is a question we need to ask ourselves as we contemplate this education series of getting kicked off today. Why provide quality education services for youth in custody? There are very obvious answers. I'm sure many of you are going, why are you asking this question? But number one, we know it's the right thing to do. Secondly, quality education is aligned with our visions and missions within the juvenile justice profession. And finally, society expects that level of service for youth who find themselves in the justice system. Also important, when you think about the reason why we're providing these services, is the fact that there are clearly compulsory school attendance laws in every state. Most juvenile justice systems codify in statute that youth can find in their systems will receive a quality education. And IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, at the federal level guarantees a youth with educational disabilities a free and appropriate education. We all know research has shown over and over again that remaining in school and achieving a terminal diploma can certainly reduce criminal activity. And an educated population provides economic stimulus across local, state, and national levels. Research has also shown that achieving educationally falls in line with better adult outcomes. And all of the school climate, and when you think of all of the school climate and social emotional learning research that's out there, it's also shown that child and adolescent resilience is highest when children and youth connect with their schools. A national survey of the 50 state juvenile justice agencies was conducted by the Council of State Governments Justice Center. It asked three main questions. First, what educational services are provided? What outcomes are collected? What supports are provided for transition? The document provides not only the findings, but recommendations that impact policy and practice, as well as provides examples for correctional education programs. They do a quality job of providing educational services for youth who are confined in a juvenile justice secure care setting. Here's a sample of data that you'll find in this report. This one just identifies what types of programs are available to youth in custody. A few of the key findings that I wanted to touch base with you on today is the first one pertains to access, right? Equal access to educational vocational services as their non-system involved peers. And then, of course, the fact that youth are in correctional education programs are in fact studying a rigorous curriculum, and we look at student performance standards just the same as they are in the public school system. Secondly, that most states in the survey identify that they do collect and track and report student outcomes, but they're not consistent as to what they track, what we collect as far as youngsters and their school progress while they're in facilities. And many policies and practices employed in many of the states make it challenging for youth released from incarceration to make effective transition to community-based educational or vocational services. Also tends to be a real issue across the country. I'll turn things over to Phil Harris, who will speak a little bit about a few pieces of research which the importance of quality correctional education. Phil?
Thank you, Simone. The fact is that knowledge of causal connections between educational programs and juvenile corrections and positive outcomes as well as recidivism is very limited. This is likely due to the difficulty in finding and accessing individual level data, isolating educational program effects from the effects of other program components, and a relatively short length of stay of kids in juvenile facilities. In terms of recidivism, more is known about the effects of education in adult correctional facilities. AS and his colleagues conducted a meta-analysis of 17 academic programs and 4 vocational education studies, and found that academic participation was reduced by 7% among adults, and vocational ed had a 9% reduction effect on recidivism. In 2013, RAND published in book form a meta-analysis of all available evaluation studies in adult corrections. They found 58 studies nationally that met their standards for inclusion. And what they found is that the likelihood of recidivism was reduced by somewhere between 13 and 43% among participants in educational programs. Bales and other colleagues reported findings from a study they conducted in Florida with Florida's juvenile correctional data. They found that relative to other juveniles, youths with above average academic achievement were more likely to attend school post-release and less likely to recidivate. Now, it's important that they found that these studies were consistent across sex and racial categories. More recently, Jennifer Steele and others followed up on the earlier RAND study and conducted a meta-analysis of eligible evaluation studies in juvenile corrections. She found only 18 eligible studies nationally, which again underscores the limited availability of evaluation studies. Her team focused on positive outcomes such as advances in reading and math performance and post-release employment, in addition to recidivism. What they found in terms of the strongest findings was that computer-assisted instruction raised reading comprehension. So that's a finding that looks like it stands there, stands alone as something we can begin to build on. Secondly, personalized learning improved diploma completion and post-release employment. Now, this last finding, while strong, is based really only on one study that was conducted in Florida. The other thing to say about this, and you can see it on the slide there, that personalized learning involves academic instruction, vocational learning opportunities, continuity and mentoring between residents and reentry, and actually small caseloads in probation for kids in a reentry status. Now, finally, it's important to keep in mind some information that came from an article by Gagnon and others. There's a fairly high proportion of kids, at least a third, who have special education needs when compared with when you compare it to like a 12% rate for public schools. These are kids with emotional behavioral disorders and learning disabilities. These are going to be the majority of the kids in juvenile facilities with disabilities of any kind. What they found was, however, that principals of these schools and the facilities overwhelmingly emphasized helping kids with getting high school diplomas and really didn't put much emphasis on vocational education, which in many cases is more appropriate for these youths. Other research has shown that kids who completed vocational training or GED while they were in the facility were twice as likely to be employed 6 months after their release. So we've got some findings here that are beginning to provide us with some direction, but at the same time, we have a lack of research, and we have to keep in mind, too, that we have kids coming into these facilities with disabilities, and we need to meet the kids where they are rather than pose some sort of standard set of expectations on them. I'm going to pass things back to Simone.
Thanks, Phil. Before we turn the webinar over to our partners at the Juvenile Law Center, I wanted to go ahead and just share two resources that have been released recently at the federal level. In late 2014, the U.S. Departments of Justice and Education jointly released the Correctional Education Guidance Package. It included a guidance document on providing high-quality educational services for youth who come into contact with the juvenile justice system. The Office of Special Educational Programming, or OSEP, issued an extensive memo on delivering special ed services for justice-involved youth. The third component of that package was guidance that pertains to the right to education for youth who are in restrictive housing. And then finally, a look at the use of Pell Grants for post-secondary education for justice-involved youth. So if we look at that guiding principle document that I mentioned as part of the package, the very first principle contemplates a safe and healthy facility-wide climate where education is a priority and youth are provided individualized behavioral and learning supports and services that promote achievement for all students, including youth who have disabilities. Principle 2 supports the need for acceptable funding necessary to support quality educational opportunities for all youth, and furthermore allows our students to receive comparable educational services to their non-system involved peers. So you can hear some repetition in what's being said earlier in my presentation and also in what Phil is saying here as far as the research is concerned. The third principle focuses on the staff. We all know that that's a critical piece to providing appropriate services for youth in any juvenile justice facility, but the recruitment, employment, and retention of quality staff who have the skills to deliver instruction to juvenile justice involved youth is critically important. This principle also covers the need for continuous staff development on the part of correctional education professionals, so that continued professional growth. Principle 4 requires schools to offer a rigorous and relevant curriculum that is aligned with state academic and career and technical standards, and the employment of instructional materials and methods that promote college and career readiness amongst the youth. And the final principle that's covered in this document is a principle that really promotes the development of policies, MOUs, and statutes, or other formal methods of really making sure or ensuring that there is a high quality educational program in juvenile justice facilities, inclusive of reentry activities. So those are the 5 overarching principles found in the document. The one final federal piece of material that I'd like to share with you, a final resource, is the US DOJ and Department of Education transition guidance package, which was released just a little bit over a year ago in December of 2016. But it includes 4 components, of which I'm not going to take the time to go over with you, but please access this resource during your leisure. The only one resource I'll share with you is the one from IndyTAC, which is the center I work on. It's funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and this is our transition toolkit. It's our 3rd edition. It's our most popular product that we developed. It includes agency and school level strategies to impact reentry. The toolkit provides existing practices in the field with real life examples, and then also provides resources that you might find useful if you're working on improving your reentry work and outcomes. It also includes a self-assessment tool where you can assess your readiness for what's recommended in this particular toolkit. So without further delay, I'd like to turn things over to Nadia Mozafa to tell us about an exciting resource recently released from the Juvenile Law Center in the city of brotherly love and the Super Bowl champs, the Philadelphia Eagles. Nadia, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you for that great introduction, and we're very happy to be here. And, you know, Philadelphia is full of very high spirits today, so we'll reflect that in the webinar as we go forward. But as was mentioned, my name is Nadia Mozafar. I'm a staff attorney at the Juvenile Law Center, and also on the call today is my colleague, Kate Burdick. And just to give you a very quick overview, I'll be going through the blueprint and the slides today, and Kate is here, and she was very instrumental in helping develop this blueprint, so she'll be available to answer questions when it's the time for that at the end. So what I wanted to do today was just to take a few minutes and go over the resource of the Blueprint for Change Education Success for Youth in the Juvenile Justice System. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Blueprint is, how it was developed, and then specifically go into the goals that we outline in the Blueprint, and then specifically talk about Goal 5, which deals with education for youth in juvenile justice facilities and how we can ensure that there is quality education for those students. So to start off with, the Blueprint was developed by the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education, which is a national collaboration of 4 organizations, including ours, the Juvenile Law Center, but also we have been working with the Southern Poverty Law Center, Education Law Center Pennsylvania, and the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law. And the overall mission for the Legal Center is to ensure that youth in and returning from the juvenile and criminal justice systems can access quality education. And we do this by building collaborations among juvenile justice and educational professionals, highlighting innovative strategies, and really working to reshape federal and local policies. And one of our greatest accomplishments so far has been the development of this Blueprint for Change Education Success for Youth in the Juvenile Justice System, which is essentially a toolkit that identifies goals of how various goals of improving education in the juvenile justice system, and also lays out how to achieve those goals. So the Blueprint, I'm just going to pull it up so we can look at it as we go through. But essentially, the Blueprint is this website, and it's jjeducationblueprint.org. And the Blueprint presents these 10 goals that set forth a broad framework for promoting education success for young people involved in the juvenile justice system. And when you click on each goal, there are correlating benchmarks which provide more specific and concrete policies and strategies for achieving the broader goal. And essentially, if you achieve these benchmarks, then they would indicate progress towards improving educational outcomes. And in addition to the benchmarks, each goal also has a list of resources that can demonstrate some of the goals in practice, or resources that can help achieve these benchmarks and the goals. So we have this set up for all 10 goals. And in addition to that, the website is pretty easy to navigate, and you can browse resources by state. So, if we click on Massachusetts, here are the list of goals and associated resources we have for Massachusetts, or, and every other state. There's also a general resources page, which has a lot of national resources and just general helpful resources that can help with some of these overall broad goals in improving juvenile justice education, in addition to some policies. So that is the overall view of the Blueprint for Change, and then we can now kind of go into some more specifics. So, and I just wanted to note that the goals and the benchmarks are also available as a PDF, and when these slides are sent out, you would have access to that as well. Before we go into the goals themselves, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we developed the Blueprint. And essentially, before the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education, Juvenile Law Center, Education Law Center, and the ABA also had a Legal Center for Foster Care and Education. And that center created a blueprint very similar to this, but it dealt with how to achieve education success for youth in the foster care system. And that blueprint was incredibly successful, and many jurisdictions and stakeholders adopted the framework or adopted the blueprint as a framework for success. So the center wanted to create a similar document around juvenile justice. And we added the Southern Poverty Law Center as an additional partner, and drafted the goals around the expertise that these partner organizations had and the experiences and in talking to stakeholders around the country. And this included in the fact that in 2013, our organizations were part of 8 listening sessions around the country where we talked to over 100 experts around the country about barriers to education and policy recommendations to come up with a draft of the goals and the benchmarks that would serve to improve educational outcomes in the juvenile justice system. And once we had this draft in April 2016, we hosted a convening of experts to get feedback and gather examples, and that led to the development of the blueprint, and we were able to put it online as a searchable website. And this is also very helpful because then it becomes a very much a living document that we update with additional resources, and we're really excited for the opportunity to connect with all of you. And if you have additional resources or there's things that you think should be added or corrected in the blueprint, we would love to continue this conversation and discuss that more. So essentially, the blueprint is designed around these 10 goals. And just very quickly, the goals have these main themes. So incorporating youth voice, appropriate adult supports, kids being educated in their communities, and when they're educated in their communities, having full opportunities to have good educational opportunities in their community, quality education in facilities, which we'll be discussing today, having supportive school environments, career pathways, post-secondary access, smooth transitions when they're coming back to their communities from placements, and protecting especially vulnerable youth. And these are the goals in detail. So we went through the themes a little bit, but just in more detail, goal 1 is to ensure that youth are informed and entrusted to make decisions about their own education and future, that youth have adult support throughout their involvement in the juvenile justice system. Whenever feasible, youth remain in their home schools, in their home communities, and when they are in their home communities, that they receive the full range of educational supports, that youth in juvenile justice placements receive a high quality educational experience, that in the placements they're educated in supportive, positive school environment, and they have access to post-secondary education and training and career pathways programs, that they have smooth transitions when they're going between juvenile placements and their home schools, and including receiving effective reentry planning and support, and finally that there's support particularly for marginalized youth, youth of color, youth of disabilities, girls, LGBTQ youth, gender expansive and transgender youth, English language learners. So that there's enough supports for these populations, especially in juvenile justice facilities. And so, we understand that the series of calls will encompass a variety of topics regarding educational outcomes for juvenile justice youth. So we hope that these 10 goals, as you go through your calls and you go through thinking about education in juvenile justice facilities, can be a good overview and framework for the types of reforms that are necessary, or just provide good resources and good starting points for broader and more detailed conversations about how to achieve these types of goals, and that the blueprint with the benchmarks and the resources can help with those conversations. And as you can see, that many of the goals are also intertwined. So, today we're going to be focusing on goal 5, which deals with making sure kids get quality education, but goal 6, which talks about, having a positive school environment and kids feeling safe and kids feeling like they have a voice, that is very much intertwined, and ensuring that kids have access to quality career pathways and post-secondary education, that all is kind of involved in ensuring that the quality of their education is there. So these are intertwined a little bit, and they'll have resources that overlap, but focus, these are also kind of important enough on their own to break out into individual goals. So today we wanted to just spend a little bit of time on Goal 5, which is that youth and juvenile justice placements receive a high quality educational experience that enables them to stay on track academically. And I have the link there for the page that will take you to Goal 5 on the blueprint. But overall, there's a few themes that the benchmarks encompass. So if you meet these general themes, this is how you know that you're getting towards a high quality educational experience that will enable your kids to stay on track. So first, it's very important early on when kids enter juvenile justice facilities that their educational needs are assessed and that they're provided programs and services that are responsive to these needs. Another huge burden deals with obtaining records immediately at the beginning of placement and at transfer. You know, I think we're all familiar with the fact that when kids' records are delayed or when there's just no adequate transfer of the records from one facility to another, from their home schools to the facilities, that just leads to kids sitting in placement without having any access to the work that they're supposed to do or any way to make progress, which is problematic, especially if they're not in a certain facility for very long. There's just not much they can do to make progress towards their educational goals. Third, high quality academics and state-aligned curriculum as what they would be provided in traditional public schools, ensuring the same type of programs are available in juvenile justice placements. Appropriate educational supports based on student need, and this encompasses a wide variety of different types of supports. So on one end of the spectrum, we have special education, which as we know is incredibly important because there's, you know, such a high percentage of students coming into juvenile justice placements have special education needs or have an IEP, that it's very important to provide those educational supports. But also English as a second language, remedial education, credit recovery. That's very important to ensure that kids stay on track, or that if they've gotten off track at some point, that they, you know, are able to make up those credits and get back so they are able to graduate in a timely manner. But also, I think it's important to recognize that there will be kids who come in who, you know, would be taking advanced placement classes or international baccalaureate classes or be qualified for gifted education. And when they're in placement, that it's also important to provide educational supports to those students as well, and including providing more advanced classes or providing gifted education for the students based on those academic needs as well. So we really want to encompass the wide range of needs that a student can come in, and the more appropriate educational supports that are provided, the more likely that that student is to be successful. We also discuss year-round education in placement settings. This essentially just means that even if it is summer vacation when someone goes to school, that there still should be education provided. And this really is based on the understanding that education is so key to the rehabilitative purpose of the juvenile justice system, that even though it's summer, it's still or like some other type of school break, it's still incredibly important to provide education during that time. And also because many students just do have, are behind in their classes or need additional credits or had credits that didn't transfer, this provides some extra time that they can gather, they can make up their credits. We also discuss no denial of education because of disciplinary reasons. Not being able to go to school should not be a punishment, even if there are, disciplinary concerns. And finally, it's important to have access to technology and the internet. And I think, these goals really line up well with what we heard before about what the research shows regarding educational success. The Jennifer Steele study, for example, specifically talked about computer-assisted instruction and personalized training and how those are important to education success. And I think the benchmark themes kind of track that, where we talk about access to technology and why that's important. And in regard to personalized training, that's why it's important to assess youth educational needs initially and every time they're transferred, and then providing whatever type of educational support is needed. So like, I'll just pull up the page. So like every other benchmark, Goal 5 also has numerous resources associated with it that can help meet these benchmarks and help meet the goal of quality education. And so if you would scroll down, you'll see that there's national resources and different types of policies that can be replicated at various levels, whether it's state statutes or policies from individual facilities, and also information about practices. And so these provide actual examples of how some of these good practices are being played out at facilities and other organizations around the country. And so, for example, right here in Philadelphia, we have Juveniles for Justice, which is the youth engagement program at the Juvenile Law Center, which we have a program for juveniles who were involved in the justice system, and they provide us with information about their experiences, which helps inform our work, and then we provide them with certain supports as well. So that's just one example, but I also wanted to highlight a couple examples from the resource section very, very briefly. And as a national example, one thing we list is the State Correctional Education Self-Assessment, which is a tool for self-assessing a state's existing special education and related services provided to youth. And it's also a tool that helps states develop and track necessary next steps for improving and expanding their educational programs. So that's one example of a national resource that's available at the toolkit that tracks this particular Goal 5 and can be something useful in that specific sense. And then on a state approach, the Missouri approach for example, is an example of a program that is done well and is doing a lot of the benchmarks and that we've discussed today. And so there's a description on the blueprint about the Missouri approach and provides like a little bit of real world application of some of the things that we're talking about. I just wanted to give Missouri a shout out since it's my home state, but it's also well known for taking a good approach to juvenile justice. And so some of the highlights of the Missouri education program is that the Missouri Department of Youth Services is fully accredited as a freestanding school district. So there is a level of quality with the education program provided there. Youth receive personalized educational plans that are developed by the Department of Youth Services with their parents and youth. So that incorporates the parent and youth voice that we discussed in our goals 1 and 2. So youth have a say in their education, and they also have their parent support. Youth attend school full-time, 12 months per year in small classes with individualized learning. They can recover academic standing and units of high school credit. There's a lot of transition supports, and overall there's really good transitional aftercare planning prior to release in Missouri. And one of the elements of that is that there's close mentorship after a youth leaves the facility and follow up to re-enroll them in school and ensure that there's a smooth transition in regard to their educational endeavors after they leave the facility. So these are just 2 quick highlights of the types of documents and the types of resources that accompany the goals and the benchmarks to provide an update on how that could be helpful. But overall, I think all of the goals kind of work together, and they all help us envision what quality education would look like in a placement facility, but also just for juveniles who are generally involved in the justice system. So we hope that was helpful, but like we said, we'd really love to hear from everyone about what would be helpful for them, what other areas we should think about that we haven't already, and here is our contact information. So please feel free to email Kate and I if there's other things that you think about, or after you've had a chance to go through the website, you have recommendations, or you're doing something in your states that would be a great resource for us. We're happy to add that in. And as one more point, I also wanted to note that we have a listserv that where we, kind of discuss these similar types of issues of juvenile justice education. And so if you send Kate an email, she can add you to that listserv. And I think I can take questions if there are any.
Hi, Nadia, it's Darlene. We do have a question for you.
Sure.
It is, do any of the pillars reference how childhood trauma impacts academic achievement and learning, and in addition to IEPs, address accommodations that are trauma responsive for learning novel information and retention, and addressing behavior and coping skills in their educational plans prior to returning to conventional education environments?
This is Kate. So we have tried to address trauma throughout, and also disability. I'm not sure I caught all of the specifics of the question, but for example, if you look at Goal 4, many of the benchmarks there are talking about youth, making sure that youth are feel safe and empowered and are not subject to blanket education-related terms of probation, for example, that fail to take into account the youth's individualized education needs and traumatic experiences. And for benchmark 6.2, which is under Goal 6, the youth in the juvenile justice placements are educated in a supportive, positive school environment where they feel safe and have a voice, is around youth are taught by staff who are trained in culturally competent, gender-responsive, trauma-informed, strengths-based, and developmentally appropriate responses to behavior. And so, we have tried to capture it in there. If you have specific suggestions on how we could better reflect that, we know, obviously, that a huge proportion of young people coming into the juvenile justice system have had adverse childhood experiences or other types of trauma, and so please feel free to pass along those suggestions. I think you also asked about IEPs and disabilities. We have tried to incorporate those both throughout the first 9 goals, because we know that special education needs are so highly represented in the system, and that's something that kind of needs to be looked at for all of the goals. But then we also have in Goal 10 kind of called out the particularly marginalized populations, including youth with disabilities, and have some specific examples of resources, policies, and practices called out, because we know that that is a particularly vulnerable population. If I didn't answer the question specifically, I'm happy to give it another go.
Thank you. We have another question. Do you have advice for special education attorneys regarding how to use the blueprint in their legal advocacy? For example, have you heard of any success in requesting that a school district follow the blueprint as part of a remedy in mediation?
This is Kate. I have not heard that as a remedy, although that would be very exciting. So we've designed the blueprint. You'll see that the goals are all written in sort of a youth-focused way. Youth need this, youth need that, as opposed to courts should do this, facilities should do that. And that was very intentional on our parts in order to allow this to be adapted for use by multiple parties. And in our foster care and education blueprint, that's something that we've seen, a lot of different stakeholders have latched onto the blueprint and been able to interpret it for their own specific goals that they're trying to accomplish in their profession. And so certainly, I think education attorneys or juvenile justice attorneys could utilize some of the information in here. And one example that's highlighted in here is in DC, special education attorneys can be appointed. And I would be very excited about talking to whoever asked that question directly about how one might use the blueprint either in general or specific aspects of it to support that type of argument in court.
And I just wanted to add that on the homepage of the blueprint, we do have a little section called How to Use the Blueprint, and that just gives some overall guidelines of how we envision the tool being used. And so it's broken out into systematic reform and direct case advocacy, which I think is what was asked in this current question. And essentially, we say that this could be used as a checklist or a guide. So, you know, as you're going through advocacy and you're thinking about whether all the needs of the student has been met, the blueprint is a really great resource to kind of go through and make sure that each of these areas is being addressed in some way. And looking at the benchmarks can provide attorneys, especially those that don't have like a ton of experience in this area, with something to compare what they're seeing for their client against.
Thank you. We have another question from an attendee. Do facilities generally allow for education beyond the basic academics, for example, health education, sexual health, nutrition, fitness, stress management, etc.?
That might be a question more for Simone and Phil as our researchers, but in my experience, yes, certainly there are facilities that are offering, you know, instruction beyond just, you know, math and reading. But, you know, we do see a wide variety of that throughout the country of what is available.
Yeah, Kate, this is Simone. Yeah, I agree with you. We've seen facilities that offered, you know, nearly the full breadth of curriculum that you see in the public school system, and others that, as the requester mentioned, you know, sort of just the basics, sort of instructional effort. But I mean, I feel certain that all of us on this call, including, you know, CJCA, would want to see a full offering of curriculum that's rigorous, that's relevant, and that follows the same curriculum that kids can get, you know, outside of the facility. So yes, I think it's pretty critical that occur.
And in Goal 7, we've highlighted specifically quality career pathways programs and how important those are to have in juvenile placements, in addition to your more traditional academic courses.
One of the resources on IndyTAC's website is a brief on social emotional learning within juvenile justice settings, and you know, it contemplates, you know, some of the very emotional, trauma-related supports that can really help a youngster become more successful in school. And of course, we know from Phil's sharing of the research that career technical vocational sort of programming is so critical for many kids who are you know, academically behind their age peers, and may not intend to go back to that traditional school, even though, you know, that's part of the mission of a juvenile justice system, is to attempt to get that youngster caught up, but then also keep them informed and abreast of and equal to the educational program within the community, and also to promote their re-enrollment and to assist them in navigating getting back into school. So, you know, yes, that full complement will only help that youngster secure a spot in the community, whether it be at a community college, a local high school, alternative sort of school, or charter school.
And I just want to highlight that what we really wanted to do with the blueprint is, the reason we have so many examples is because there are places that are doing things really well and can be a resource for other jurisdictions or other stakeholders that are just starting to think about these topics. So, you know, we hope that if you are in the position of kind of realizing what the barriers are and that you have a long way to go with the population you're working with, we encourage you to look at the 10 goals, to figure out where your gaps are, where there are opportunities for growth, and then to check out those examples and connect directly with the people who are doing them really well. And by kind of, putting them all together in one place, we've tried to make that easier and show the broad array of ways that people have come at these problems.
We have another question about post-secondary education goals. Are there funding streams or laws, state or federal, that entitle students to receive education, programming or services, post-secondary and CTE vocational after attainment of a GED or high school diploma while they are still in a facility?
This is Simone. Title I Part D dollars can be utilized for career technical education and supporting youth within a juvenile justice setting or even an adult setting. The Title I Part D dollars can be utilized in adult corrections for youth who meet the eligibility criteria, and one of them is age, being 21 or younger. Now, these are not large sums of money, but they were designed by the feds to supplement educational programming that is funded by the state. But Title I Part D dollars can be utilized in a supplemental way. The Office of Correctional Education at the U.S. Department of Education, Sean Addy, is the project officer. He would be somebody who could probably identify the exact funding sources that could be utilized. Kate, do you have anything you want to add to Phil and I?
Yeah, so I also want to add that in the 2014 Correctional Education Guidance Package that Simone mentioned early on the call, that Departments of Ed and Justice put out December 2014, there was clarification there about the use of Pell Grants to support higher ed access for youth in juvenile justice facilities. We also have that on our blueprint under both Goal 8, which is around higher ed, and under general resources. And if you look on the blueprint Goal 8 and scroll down to the examples section, there are some examples of places that have found funding more state-based than federal. And I'm sure there's more out there that we don't have, and that's why, again, we turn to you all to help us fill this out with what is working in your jurisdiction. But I think you can see some creative ways that other jurisdictions have found funding by starting with the list we do have up on Goal 8.
We have another question on, is anyone conducting language impairment screenings as part of the educational assessment process, IEP or general, in response to the recent research on the prevalence of language impairment among juvenile offenders?
That is not one I know off the top of my head, but if someone wants to email us, we can try to track down an answer for later, or unless Simone or Phil know that.
With child find activities, which if you look at the OSEP memo, the Office of Special Education Program memo, that's part of that guidance package. It talks about child find and also support services that youth who find themselves in the juvenile justice system may need in order to help level that playing field for them. And speech services, hearing services, screenings are all part of that. Most juvenile justice state-operated facilities, and that's what I'm most familiar with, so I will make the statement about state-operated facilities, do in fact screen, vision, hearing, speech, those sorts of things when a youngster is admitted to the system. Peter, I don't know if it's something you want to talk about as to maybe what you do in Massachusetts, if you have that information handy, or Mike, if you can speak to that in specifics. But I know a majority of states do in fact provide screening. That is correct.
I know, this is Peter. I know we do a pretty comprehensive educational assessment for young people that are committed to the Department of Youth Services. I'm not real clear on the question related to, speech impairment. I'm not exactly sure what that answer is. Sorry.
And we have a question. Have you seen the goals benchmarks used for school improvement plans for education providers and facilities with juvenile justice youth?
This is Kate. So this is a relatively new tool. So we have not actually seen it used beyond a couple of examples because it's just recently getting out there and we're in sort of the dissemination phase right now. Could it be used for a variety of things? Absolutely. And we are happy with our partners at Education Law Center, ABA Center on Children in the Law, and Southern Poverty Law Center to work with people who are interested in trying to adapt it for different needs.
Peter, that was the majority of the questions we received.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank the presenters, Kate, Nadia, Phil, and Simone, for taking the time to give us that overview. It was very helpful, and it was for me, it was an important start to the series. The next call that we're doing is around classroom excellence, and we're still in the process of trying to pin down the date. I believe it's March 12th, but we still have to pin that down, and we'll get that notice out. We have 8 or 9 sessions that are lined up for 2018. I talked to Mike Dempsey yesterday about getting that calendar out to folks that are on this call, and we'll work on that so you'll be able to get them on your calendar. And I'm looking forward to not only a rich conversation, but a progressive process for education for young people that are justice involved in across the country. So I want to thank CJCA and Darlene and Brendan and the team over there for your support. And we'll be getting back out for the second call regarding classroom excellence. I think that's it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your involvement.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for focusing on this issue.
You bet.